All right, let's dive straight in today. We're looking at something that's making some serious waves across Europe right now. We're talking about the recent Polish presidential election.
Yeah, a really pivotal one.
You've got a whole stack of material here, articles, research, analysis, and we're going to use all of that as our guide.
Right.
Our mission really is to dig in, understand these results, and figure out what this outcome really signals.
Nie pozwolę na to, aby bezpieczeństwo Polek i Polaków było zagrożone przez nielegalnych migrantów. Nasze życie ekonomiczne i gospodarcze przez wprowadzenie waluty euro. Nie zgodzę się na to, aby podpisano nowe traktaty Unii Europejskiej i aby Polska straciła swoją suwerenność w tak wielu sektorach życia społecznego. Pozwólcie Państwo, że zwrócę się teraz do moich kontrkandydatów. Dziś tylko kandydat zmiany. Tylko kandydat zmiany potrzebny jest Rzeczpospolitej. Kandydat zmiany tego, co dzisiaj dzieje się w Polsce. Musimy powstrzymać marsz Donalda Tuska do jednowładztwa. I w tym wielkim marszu, w tym wielkim ruchu społecznym jest miejsce dla wszystkich, którzy mówią: po pierwsze Polska, po pierwsze Polacy. Niech żyje Polska do zwycięstwa!
Not just for Poland, but, for the bigger picture too.
And it's true, this election is incredibly significant. As the material we looked at points out, Poland it sits right in the middle of a geopolitical crossfire. So all eyes were absolutely on this presidential race. And it wasn't just about the specific candidates on the ballot. It felt like it was really about the two powerful rivals behind the scenes, the major political forces really battling it out.
Okay. Let's maybe unpack the process first, because that seems pretty key to understanding the whole setup. Poland has this two-round election system. So the first round happened, a couple of weeks back?
That's right.
And it had a pretty crowded field. I think 13 candidates started out.
Yeah, quite a few.
But because nobody hit that magic number, over 50% of the vote, which the analysis we read mentioned almost never happens anyway in the first round.
Right. Very rare.
The top two candidates just advanced to a runoff. Simple as that.
Exactly. And those two candidates who came out on top from that first round, well, the reports say they could not be more different.
Oh, really? Who were they?
So first you had Rafał Trzaskowski. He's the mayor of Warsaw from the centrist Civic Platform Party. He got 31.4%. And he's known as a close ally of the current Prime Minister, Donald Tusk.
Okay, Civic Platform. Got it. And the other?
The other was Karol Nawrocki. Now, he ran officially as an independent, but he was very clearly backed by the Conservative Law and Justice Party, PiS. He got 29.5% in that first round.
Right, PiS. Okay, so barely 2 percentage points between them in the first round.
Very close. And yeah, the contrast between their politics, their visions, it's truly stark, according to everything we've read.
So our goal today, then, for you listening, is to really get into what makes these two so different, what actually happened in that second round, the outcome, and maybe most importantly, try to understand the potentially huge implications of this result. For Poland, yes, but also for Europe and, for you, wherever you are, as part of that broader European dynamic.
Okay, so the big news from that second round, the runoff, we have a winner.
Yeah.
Karol Nawrocki, the candidate backed by PiS, won the Polish presidency.
Wow.
Yeah, just edging out Rafał Trzaskowski by a couple of percentage points, so still very tight.
Just a couple of points again.
Exactly. The analysis we have describes this as a major victory for Nawrocki personally and for PiS, and it also notes it's likely a setback for Brussels.
Why specifically for Brussels?
Well, it highlights that relations between the EU institutions and the law and justice camp, PiS, have been strained for years. So a PiS-backed president isn't seen as making things easier there.
Right, that makes sense. That's a really tight margin, though, for such a potentially significant outcome.
Yeah.
So maybe step back a bit. What does winning the presidency actually mean in Poland? Like, what kind of power does Nawrocki now hold?
Yeah, that's a crucial question, definitely. Poland operates under what's called a semi-presidential system.
Semi-presidential, okay.
So you have the prime minister, currently Donald Tusk from Civic Platform. He's the head of government, handles a lot of the day-to-day executive power, runs the cabinet.
Right.
But the president, now Nawrocki, has some very specific and, frankly, very powerful roles.
Such as?
Well, for starters, they're a commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They appoint top military officials. And here's the really critical part in domestic politics. They have the power to veto legislation.
Oh, okay, the veto. That sounds like it could create some friction, right?
Yeah.
Especially with a prime minister from a completely different political party.
Exactly. It's the classic cohabitation setup, potentially leading to gridlock.
Does the material give an example of how that veto power is actually played out recently?
It does, yeah. And it's a perfect illustration of this potential for gridlock. When the Tusk government came into power, they promised to reverse these really controversial judicial reforms that had been put in place by the previous Pius government.
Okay, I remember hearing about those. Big issue with the EU, wasn't it?
Huge issue.
Hmm.
Critics argued, and the EU largely agreed, that these reforms undermined judicial independence and violated EU law. It was a key reason billions in EU funds for Poland were held up.
Right. So Tusk wanted to repeal them.
Exactly. Tusk's government tried to pass laws to repeal them. But the president at the time, Andrzej Duda, who was also from the Pius camp, used his veto power. He blocked the repeal. So despite the government having a majority in parliament and wanting to make this change, they were effectively stuck. The president stopped them.
Wow. Okay, so the president can just basically stop the government in its tracks on certain laws, even major ones.
On any law passed by Parliament, yes, Parliament can try to override the veto, but it requires a higher majority, which Tusk's coalition doesn't have on its own.
And now with Nawrocki, who's backed by PS, the party opposed to Tusk in that presidential office.
Mm-hmm.
What does the research suggest about the political landscape going forward? Is it just more of the same gridlock?
Well, the analysis we've seen is pretty clear on this, with Nawrocki now in office, who's coming in with what's described as a fresh mandate from an election that was effectively seen as a kind of referendum on Tusk's government.
Right.
The prediction is that the gridlock is only likely to deepen.
Deepen. Okay. Not great news for Tusk's government then.
Probably not. There's even a quote in the material from a senior PS lawmaker saying something like, "From Tuesday, we will begin very energetic work to give the Polish people another gift, the end of Tusk's government."
Wow. Okay, so they're not hiding their intentions.
Not at all. It strongly suggests Tusk could be facing what's sometimes called a lame duck period for the rest of his term, at least until the next parliamentary elections. It could make passing any significant, potentially controversial reforms nearly impossible. That veto power is going to be a major, major obstacle for Tusk.
Okay, that paints a really clear picture of potential internal friction, maybe even paralysis on some issues. But let's zoom out again. Beyond the gridlock, why was this election outcome seen as so potentially impactful for Poland's direction? Let's go back to those fundamental differences you mentioned earlier between the two candidates.
Yeah.
What do the sources say about their core platforms, their visions for Poland? Let's start with Nawrocki, the winner.
Okay, Nawrocki. The descriptions really emphasize a strong nationalist message. His campaign slogan apparently was Poland first, Poles first.
Right.
He's described consistently as anti-migrant and quite Eurosceptic. So resistant to deeper EU integration, wanting to claw back powers from Brussels, that sort of thing.
And anything else that stood out?
Yeah, interestingly, the material highlights him as an outspoken admirer of Donald Trump.
Really?
Yeah. His campaign apparently mirrored some Trumpian themes. Strong opposition to immigration, rejecting what he termed woke values, and really prioritizing bilateral ties with the United States, often over Brussels. It even mentions he met with Trump during the campaign and reportedly got his endorsement. And just a bit of color from the reports, apparently he's also an amateur boxer.
Okay. So definitely a specific nationalist, maybe populist ideological stance there. And Trzaskowski, the runner-up, what was his vision, according to the sources?
Trzaskowski presented a very different picture, much more liberal, definitely pro-European. As the mayor of Warsaw, he's been a pretty vocal critic of the kind of populist nationalism that Nawrocki represents.
So almost the opposite then.
In many ways, yes. He advocated for closer integration with EU partners. The sources specifically mention him championing the newly energized Weimar Triangle. That's the cooperation framework between Poland, Germany, and France.
Ah, yes, the Weimar Triangle, trying to revive that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a big focus for him was on implementing rule of law reforms, the kind necessary to align Poland back with core EU values and, crucially, unlock access to those billions in EU funds that have been frozen because of the previous judicial disputes under Pius.
Got it. So really two very different paths being offered for Poland there. What about foreign policy specifically? I mean, the region's security is such a huge topic right now. Did they differ much there?
Well, there's actually one significant point of overlap mentioned. Both candidates seem to agree on the need for heavy defense spending. Poland's been really ramping that up.
Okay, so agreement on defense spending, but what about key relationships? Ukraine, the EU itself.
Yeah, that's where they diverge quite significantly, according to the analysis we have.
How so? Let's take Ukraine first.
Okay. Trzaskowski, the pro-EU candidate, clearly views Ukraine's future as being inside the EU and potentially NATO down the line. He sees strong support for Kyiv as absolutely essential for overall European security.
And refugees.
He supported aid for Ukrainian refugees already in Poland, but the sources also note he backed tightening benefits somewhat and also stricter asylum limits at the border with Belarus, which has been a flashpoint.
Right, the Belarus border situation. Okay.
Yeah.
And Nawrocki on Ukraine.
Nawrocki also supports Ukraine's fight against Russia's invasion. That's pretty much consensus in Poland. But the material notes he explicitly draws the line at full EU or NATO membership for Ukraine.
Ah, okay. That's a key difference.
Definitely. And mirroring his domestic platform, he takes a generally stricter line on immigration overall, really emphasizing prioritizing Poles first and wanting to curb refugee support more broadly, not just regarding Ukrainians.
Okay, so clear differences on Ukraine's future path and on immigration policy. What about Poland's relationships within the EU itself under a Nawrocki presidency? You mentioned he's Eurosceptic.
Yeah, and this could be another major point of impact. Nawrocki is seen as supporting the PS Party's broader vision, which involves seeking sort of alternative alliances within the EU.
Alternative alliances, like who?
The reports mention looking towards countries like Slovakia and maybe Hungary under Orban places that have also had their own friction with Brussels over rule of law or other issues, kind of a bloc of skeptical nations.
Interesting.
And he's described as deeply skeptical of Europe's push toward strategic autonomy. Meaning the EU trying to build up its own defense capabilities, becoming a bit more independent from NATO, or rather from the U.S. within NATO. Nawrocki is apparently critical of reducing reliance on the U.S. The sources quote him, or paraphrase sentiment, seeing Washington as Poland's only credible security partner.
Wow. So that could affect things like the Weimar Triangle you mentioned earlier, that Polish-German-French cooperation.
Exactly. The analysis suggests that the recent momentum towards closer ties with Germany and France, including reviving that Weimar Triangle framework, well, it may not last under Nawrocki. His focus seems much more tilted towards the U.S. relationship, potentially at the expense of deeper EU integration, especially on security.
Okay. Wow. So just to kind of pull this all together, this election isn't just about who holds the presidential title in Poland. It seems to have really direct, tangible implications for potential government gridlock, for the direction of reforms, maybe even for things like accessing those EU funds that affect the Polish economy directly.
Absolutely.
The core takeaway from all the material we've looked at really seems to be that Poland's internal political situation, particularly this likely deepening gridlock between a PiS-backed president and the civic platform-led government, will surely increasingly limit its role on the European stage.
That sums it up well. The internal divisions could really hamper its external influence and engagement.
Okay.
And that leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty significant question to maybe mull over, drawing together everything we've discussed based on these sources.
Okay.
If a president's specific constitutional powers, like the ability to block legislation with a veto, can fundamentally stall a government's entire agenda, especially when it comes to major reforms, maybe ones tied to international agreements or vital funding, and can also noticeably shift a country's stance on key alliances like NATO or its approach to EU integration. Well, what does that really tell us about the stability and maybe the predictability we can expect from key European partners when their own internal politics become so deeply polarized? It's a dynamic that clearly ripples outward, doesn't it?